We already have a couple of questions. I'm going to ask the attendees to be a little bit patient because now I really want to ask and go to the growers. Again, we can start this time with Bruce. I'm going to do it the other way around from west to east. Bruce, what we would like to know, if you can give very briefly, just a kind of an overview of what you think are the conditions or the limiting conditions in Washington, because clearly are different from what we know about New York or Michigan. And then just briefly also say, what are your management in terms of nutrition? And more specifically, probably nitrogen and calcium application.
When you said limiting conditions, you actually lost me there a bit. Specifically, what are you looking for in response to that?
Yeah, well, so important is the soil. So again, Lee mentioned that in Washington, we normally do not have a limiting condition in terms of calcium availability. And that's something that I can share with you all. And also we have in most of our growing area is more as kind of like a silt loam type of soil with very low organic matter, and we have high pH. So maybe I answered that question. But overall, what are those limiting factors? Because the levels of organic matter in Washington are really low, below the 0.1. So that is key probably for a lot of root health conditions. So I wanted to make kind of like a context of Washington and then move on to the practice.
Okay, I'll make one quick observation in regards to limiting factors. We farm over a very wide geographical area with many different soil types, from actually sandy loam to heavy clays. And we have significantly different levels of calcium and potassium in some of those soils. But it's interesting to note that one of the locations where we actually have our highest soil potassium levels is an orchard that actually produces the least amount of bitter pith. And one of the orchards that has absolutely the lowest potassium levels tends to have the highest incidence or higher incidence of bitter pith. But they're obviously very different climatically. I'll run through our basic program. We have, over the last, our standard program used to be that we would put 30 to 40 pounds of, this is on a mature orchard, 30 to 40 pounds of nitrogen broadcast across the entire orchard floor with the intent of actually trying to feed the cover crop a bit. And then we might add another 10 to 20 to 30 pounds, depending on what we thought of the tree vigor. Over the last few years, and doing much more intensive leaf tissue sampling, we have backed our nitrogen levels down to, we've done away with trying to feed the cover crop because that gives us too much nitrogen. And we are doing pretty much 99% of our nitrogen with fertigation applied through drip, but we're only doing about 10 pounds of actual N per acre. We're using calcium nitrate. Actually, what we're using is CN9 because we're after a higher level of calcium, if at all possible. We have a typical spray program as far as other nutrients in Washington, zinc, boron, typically done in the spring and fall. We do a foliar 10 pounds of nitrogen post-harvest, try to get that on, time and weather permitting. Our spray program for calcium has been almost exclusively calcium chloride. We've run the gamut from every time you go through the orchard and there's not a compatibility issue, which may result in 8 to 10 sprays per year during the growing season, to, for several years, we actually tried to spray every, a minimum of once a week. with calcium chloride. We have to back up Lee's comments about it's just hard to get enough calcium on through the foliar program. We don't really see much difference between spraying the calcium chloride when it's compatible with something else in the orchard, in the spray tank, versus being just very focused on getting the calcium on at once a week. That's a tall order, and it's very demanding.
And I will come back to you later when we start talking more about irrigation. There's a lot of questions about that, and I know you've done some work on that. But just to move on the nutrition side, Chris, can you share what are your nutrient management practices?
So thanks, Brittany. So we grow mainly Budagowski 9 on Honeycrisp, and we've got a couple different sites. One of our sites is a little bit more of a clay loam, and the other site's more of a loamier sand. So we've got two different areas that we actually treat. And so when we go to plant an orchard, we know that using Budagowski 9 that we for sure have to push that tree the first 3 years. There's no doubt about it. If we're going to use the benefits of the Bud 9 as far as bitter pit control, then we got to push the tree. We got to fill the space. So usually the first year when we plant the tree, we give it just enough water to make sure that the tree is surviving. You can overwater trees the first year. The second year, we'll definitely hit the water a lot harder. And we don't give any ground applied fertilizer the first year. As soon as that tree goes through transplant shock, year 2, year 3 is when you really want to push the tree hard and fill space. So we do push the tree hard year 2 and year 3. We'll put on at least 3 to 4 shots, usually 4 shots calcium nitrate at about 25 pounds of actual N. That is a banned application. After we've got our space filled, we'll back off calcium nitrate. We'll put on, once that tree's established in a fruiting mode, we'll look at putting at least 1 to 2 shots of calcium nitrate on early from that pink to petal fall stage. And that depends on, we've got some areas where we get really good tree growth, and we got some areas in the same block where it needs a little bit of help. So we'll treat it accordingly. We do spray a lot of calcium nitrate on the orchard. In Michigan, we in the spring, we're always spraying, it seems like. So we've always got calcium in the tank. And then we will try and put calcium nitrate on in season after our primary scab is over. And we'll try and get that calcium on once a week. But we have used a lot of calcium chloride in the past. We do use a lot of other forms, other brands of foliar calciums. We do use some gypsum as well. But we really try and push that tree in the earlier years, and I do believe that the genetics and the Bud 9 really help us on bitter pit control. So we got to keep pushing that tree as much as possible, and it's a visual on looking at the tree and how hard we pushed it. So Michigan's kind of a funny state. We seem to have extremes one way or the other. And it seems like when everybody's doing their hardest to try and minimize bitter pit, there's some years where everybody has a little bit of bitter pit. And then, when the fruit leaves the orchard, it always looks great. And then it gets into storage, and next thing you know, they're packing the fruit, and it has a little more bitter pit than we anticipated. So I think we have extreme weather in Michigan, meaning, this year we had at least 6 weeks, if not 8 weeks of drought. Here this last weekend, we got 5 to 7 inches of rain. So we go from one extreme to the other, and I think that makes it a little bit tough for bitter pit control. We've got some older, some bigger rootstocks on the farm, and not on Honeycrisp, but some other varieties. We've done a lot of root pruning and actually left some test trees. I mean, you can actually see the control of bitter pit right to the tree when we did do quite a bit of root pruning, and we actually, believe it or not, picked up a little bit more color because less vigor, and actually picked up another pound in that fruit at harvest time. So we do a lot of playing on the farm, and that might be something that if somebody's got some very vigorous rootstocks on Honeycrisp, you might want to look at root prunes while you got some type of support system. So, but
Thank you, Chris. Great advice. Rod.
So yeah, great comments from both Bruce and Chris, and very similar to what we're doing. And I make a sort of overarching comment that what becomes quite apparent is that people who are succeeding at this are doing a lot to manipulate their orchards, their nutrition status, their rootstocks, their canopies. And you can't stop doing any particular one part of it. You have to pay this real attention to detail on all parts. So for our attention to detail in terms of nutrition, for a very long time, we had, I'm sure Leilang would say, quite a different nutrition program to most in New York. And we're not putting on any nitrogen fertilizers on any varieties, Honeycrisp included, before bloom. And have kind of changed that a little bit specifically for Honeycrisp, and gone now to almost completely all nitrogen applied to established blocks where the canopy's filled is foliar post-harvest. So we're trying to build some strength into that bud and give us a little bit of pop in this early part of the season, but there's no nitrogen applied on established canopies on the ground after that. Now we do have high organic matter numbers, so we usually range in the 2 to 3%, 3.5% in some blocks. So we have a lot of natural nitrogen that's coming to us every season, no matter what. One of the other things that's I think has really helped us in terms of calcium and managing bit effect. Most of our productive Honeycrisp orchards are on B9, so that limits the percentage you're going to get ordinarily. And we'd be surprised on any season to get over 5%. So it's typically not a significant issue, but 5% of a Honeycrisp crop is a lot of dollars. So, you know, you're trying to manage it back down to as close to zero as you can get. But some of Terrence's work and others with Leilang in terms of the lack of calcium availability if there's a drought stress period shortly after bloom has influenced how we do our irrigation scheduling now. So Honeycrisp gets a lot more water a lot quicker if we sense any kind of rainfall shortage or soil moisture deficit at bloom or that month right after. I think we've definitely seen some benefits from that. And we do spray, we've only ever really sprayed calcium chloride. We did a lot of work 20 years ago with different chelated calciums and all the different snake oil that came through. And all we ever did was spend more money and didn't get any more results. And basically on a once a week calcium chloride program, and the only way to get to Lee's 40 or 50 pounds is to do it 14 or 15 times. We don't like to spray more than 3 pounds per acre per application in about 60 gallons of water. Otherwise we risk some leaf burning. So, you know, there's always a balance to what you're trying to do. From our perspective, the cost of that calcium in an application, if it can make us 1% or 2% of a crop every year or avoid a 6 or 7% year, then the payback is good. And it's about maintaining that focus on details and trying to do everything you can to maximize its value. Never want to throw money away, but there's some things that really, especially with Honeycrisp, you lose at your peril. We had a really good conversation at the end of the IFTA meetings, and Bernadita pretty much convinced me I should stop spraying calcium every week. And then you go to bed at night and put your head on the pillow and go, well, it sounds great, but hell no. So I don't know, Bernadita. I think
have to spend more time then with you.
Yes. So yes, and I think there's probably 9 years out of 10, there's probably every reason to argue that, and we may be wasting some money, but sleeping at night has a price too. So, you know, everything's risk management, and how you do that economically in your own mind is a very individual thing. So we're not a lot different. We're very similar to Chris's program in terms of nitrogen and calcium management, just trying to pay attention to every little detail where we can gain a step here and a step there amongst, 1,000 steps to get to the end.
Thank you, Rod. And a question for the three of you. have you ever tried to do a trial and to not add calcium at all and compare with a calcium application spray? I'm talking about the spray calcium. So for those of you that do apply gypsum, I think it's a good strategy because not only for calcium, but also other problems that you might have in your soils. But in regards to the spray, have you ever not apply anything and compare between sprayed and non-spray?
The only comparison we've ever done is frequency of treatments, and our lowest frequency is 8 to 10 applications versus the 15 plus, and really have not seen much of any difference.
I would say that we definitely see, if we looked at a 10-year trend, we definitely see less bitter pit since we've been spraying on basically a weekly basis. In general, it's hard to put your finger on it. Part of it may just be tree age, right? So we're not doing scientific experiments to know that, but part of it's sleeping at home.
But a different way to question to the Washington community, Bruce, could be: do we have Washington fruit grower not applying calcium foliarly and not having bitter pit issues? Do we have those growers?
To my knowledge, virtually every Washington grower applies calcium of some type in some form.
Only when Lee and I get our hands on the orchard, probably.
I've seen one orchard that said they did not apply any calcium, and it was extremely low vigor site on B9 in a very high elevation cool site. And that's probably where it wasn't needed. But that would be the far exception to the rule.
Okay.
So there's a lot of questions and we don't have too much time, but I want to go back to the irrigation just so we don't miss that question that has come on and on in every session. Bruce, you mentioned that you've been changing your irrigation scheduling and that you think, or you, in the video at least, you think you make a difference. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, we, our standard irrigation system is a sprinkler system, which is both under tree and over tree. Under tree for frost control in the spring, over tree for summer cooling. We also have a drip system in most of our orchards. Over the last 2 years, we have done a significant amount of trying to apply deficit irrigation. Unfortunately, this year that went out the board over the end of the shift this week. We're dumping every gallon of water we get our hands on, trying to mitigate 115-degree temperatures. But we have invested a lot of time and effort into trying to manage our irrigation to make sure that we're not over irrigating, even if we're not trying to induce a deficit, which we are intentionally trying to induce a deficit in Honeycrisp. We've done such a huge amount of cooling over the last 15, 20 plus years, actually 25 plus years, that we've seen the negative effects if you create a swamp in the orchard. And I think that if you back that up, if you're over irrigating, or if you're in a farm situation where you regularly irrigate, if you're over irrigating, I think that potentially has a significant negative impact, not just on Honeycrisp, but all the apples you grow. But we are fortunate in Washington where we can control the amount of water put on the trees, which is not true necessarily in New York or in the Midwest.
Bernadette, this is Essie. Can I make a quick comment about irrigation?
Of course.
As you know, we have done over, I think 18 something years of extensive irrigation study in Idaho, mostly on Fuji. One thing that we noticed in all of our trials was that whenever we are using the method of irrigation makes a major difference on potassium uptake. For drip, when we are using drip versus sprinkler, drip has less uptake of potassium. And every time that was true. And then the other one is that whenever you have more volume of water, you have more potassium. Because all of discussion we had here about potassium, I think that's very important to pay attention to irrigation. That was one of the questions that audience asked, and I was very interested to mention this. Thank you.
Thank you, Essie, and probably Lee also have something to add to that question on how irrigation management impact nutrient uptake and what are the critical timing to be aware of.
Yeah, Essie put it how I would put it. But Bernardita, you have a project on timing of uptake. Do you wanna weigh in on that?
Yeah, well, so thank you, Lee. For me, I don't want to, there's so many topics, right, that we would like to cover in it's like almost 7 minutes left, but I would like to kind of bring it back to maybe just 2 key points. One is that, first of all, the importance that everyone have indicated, and there's reviews from the 70s and before that show the importance of uptake early in the season for calcium development of the cell wall. So that stage, and you have mentioned this, Lee, of that deficit irrigation early stage is really fatal for bitter pit development. And so the irrigation has to be secure in that early stage because it relates to the uptake of calcium through the roots, which is the main pathway, right? And to develop that cell wall. So that for me is a key. And that's why also last week when we talk about drought and dry, there are a lot of reports that already support the idea that Terence was hypothesizing that shows that dry weather will affect and increase bitter pit, especially that early in the season, and supported with a lot of your work, Lee. But secondly, is this work that we've been doing, and there's also a lot of support that shows that, and Essie mentioned this before, we're talking about rootstock, crop load, nitrogen levels, and I think everything comes down to the excessive vigor. When we have high crop load, we have a more balanced tree. When we have low crop load, we have more shoot competition, and that translate into more water uptake, and water uptake translate into more potassium uptake that Essie mentioned last time too. So if you have a vigorous rootstock, you need to control the vigor, especially later in the season where calcium no longer can get into your fruit, but you do have still uptake of nitrogen and potassium because both elements are very mobile in your plant. And that's why Essie probably show also that leaf tissue relation potassium to calcium is a good indicator for fruit size, because potassium is a mobile element and it will increase when you have a higher size of fruit because of that increase of water. So it's all related for me to vigor. So if you control vigor later in the season by managing water, by managing even root pruning, if you want to play with root pruning later in the season, that is an option, but also a lot of the work done by this group from Brazil that shows PGR use are also related to that controlling vigor later in the season. So those are kind of my key message. Early season, secure calcium availability and root growth, and later in the season, control the vigor of your orchard, which you are doing by having a more dwarfing rootstock. But if you don't have that, you can control by the deficit irrigation that Lee has shown a lot of information regarding that reduced bitter pit level with that deficit irrigation later in the season.
or root pruning, I know. And then, you know, some growers are also trying, you know, taking off some of the excess vigorous shoots that are on their tree to get it to calm down, or breaking the tips. There's a lot of different approaches. Summer pruning. Yeah, there's a lot of different approaches to just reduce that leaf area later in the season.
Bernardita, when you mentioned the Brazilian group, are those apogee trials pre-harvest?
Yes, these are 5.
Can you share?
Yes, so this work is done by, you can online on Google for Amarantes or the Freitas. That group has done a lot of work and carry over work from tomato with the brown end rot, which is another calcium related disorder. They continue the work with apples, and they have done amazing reviews and summaries of what could be the problem. And so if you look online for Amarantes and the Freitas, you will find that paper, and what they show is that a later application of apogee was very good. 5 weeks before harvest, every week, reduce bitter pit levels.
Off label.
Completely.
Yes.
Okay, so
Completely.
the point is, I think it's about that vigor management. There are also other topics that Lailang mentioned about the ripening or maduration that I think I agree with you, Lailang. I think it's I'm very curious about that situation. And I think this is something we could cover in the next meeting in post-harvest, because there is preliminary work that have shown, I think it was from Ferguson in New Zealand, that show how the rate of ripening accelerates when you have lower levels of calcium. So high levels of calcium in the fruit reduce the ripening process, and that also leads to reduced levels of bitter pit. So that's very interesting to follow up on that.
Hey, Bernadita, I see Chris, he keeps unmuting himself. Chris, do you have something to add? We keep talking about root pruning and irrigation.
Yeah, I just thinking a little bit. So, you know, I was talking to Anna today, and one thing, we got some great information. We got some great information on rootstocks. We've talked about calcium and nutrition. But one thing that, you know, in my travels that I see is that there's a lot of orchards that are planted that you have to make sure your basics are covered, and you have to make sure the site is prepared properly. You pick the right site. If it's a wet site, then you're going to have to put the right amount of drain tile, if not a little bit more in. Irrigation's a must when it comes to these dwarfing rootstocks. When you plant an orchard, you know, you have to be ready to get that irrigation in ASAP, especially if it's been dry for 14 days. So in these conversations, it's really good, but there's a lot of things that I see growers that miss, and, you know, support systems, making sure the right support system. I can't tell you how many times I walk in an orchard and so many of the leaders aren't tied up, but, you know, just make sure that the sites are prepared. So if you're going to use Budogowski 9, you have to have everything in place. You have to have a vision, you have to have a plan, and the spacing has to be right. And you're going to have to plan on being aggressive, and you're going to have to plan on feeding that tree the first 3 or 4 years and then backing off. The payoff with Bud 9 on Honeycrisp is the back end. It's like buying a stock. You can pay up front or you can pay at the end. It's your choice, but you definitely need to put some work into planning and some of these systems and consistency. You need consistency, and you need to babysit these trees. The first year, the second year, and third year, you need to be out looking at these trees all the time and seeing what they need. You need to make sure that they're being sprayed. You get the aphids off and the hoppers off them. No apple scab on the leaves. You know, no powdery mildew. You have to keep these trees in tip-top shape. And I just want to make those comments, because if you pick a rootstock, if you want to use a Geneva rootstock or Bud 9, and you don't do these basic fundamentals, it'll be a disaster at the end of the day. So you won't meet your full potential. So,
and yeah, to support that, good quality trees from the nursery that are uniform. That's that's essentially if we're going to be kind of riding on the edge of bud 9.
Could I ask Bruce a question on the compost application? Because in the video, Bruce, you mentioned that for some of the blocks, you have Honeycrisp blocks, you have been applying up to 10 tons of compost. So just curious about the
25 tons.
Up to 25 tons. So just curious about the nitrogen content of those compost. And you also made the comment that, you know, we stop applying nitrogen, but the leaf nitrogen level stays up there around 2.4, 2.5. So I just want to try to find out if it has anything to do with the compost application.
Good question. To Chris's point, our standard pre-plant program is, and this is whether it's Honeycrisp or any other variety, is old orchard site, tree removal, deep ripping, typically with a D8 or D7 cat down to 36 to 42 inches, fumigation, post fumigation, this application of 20 to 25 tons of typically dairy compost. Yakima Valley, Columbia Basin is a big dairy producing region, so it's readily available. I'm guessing, because I get different reports from different vendors, probably 2.5%, 3%. One of the negative aspects of this is we're dumping a huge amount of potassium on the ground.
That's another
compost. But we're trying to fill the space irrespective of whatever the rootstock is by the end of the third leaf. And so we're very aggressive about this, prepping the soil, the comments about irrigation system, trellis, having the limbs tied up, all that. Chris is spot on. Your whole process should be so well organized that it's not a matter of finding something to add to the plant. It's a matter of avoiding making any timing mistakes and subtracting from the execution by being sloppy or late. If you do that, you know, I think it's very realistic to be able to fill your space in by the end of the third week.
Yeah. So Bruce, if the nitrogen content is 2%, if you apply 10 tons per acre, that gives you 400 pounds of nitrogen, total nitrogen. In the first few years, probably in the next 2 to 3 years, the first year probably you get 30 to 50% of that nitrogen, and then later years you may get one third roughly. But even by the year 4 or 5, probably you still have some nitrogen in there. So do you think that allows the trees to stay at the high nitrogen level, even though you didn't apply any chemical fertilizer?
Yeah, I suspect it would, but I mean, I'm talking about blocks that are 10th, 15th leaf. So they're moved from a compost program. But we also used to go through, up until about 4 years ago, with 2 to 3 tons of compost applied per orchard acre, but it would be 2 to 3 tons that was banded into the herbicide strip. We went away from that. We thought that potentially was having a deleterious effect on fruit condition. So we once we get a block, once a block is mature, we're not using compost.
Yeah, I think that's very important. Because Bill Bramlage, a professor at UMass, used to say that he had in a farm, and there was a farm in Massachusetts where it was an old dairy farm. These manures were sprayed, and then that orchard never produced a good quality fruit for the entire life of the orchard. So I think sometimes if you apply too much manure or compost, the nitrogen level stays high, and also potassium. If it's a chicken, you know, those compost, there's a lot of potassium in it as well. So just want to,
Yeah, to your point, Lailang, I think that's one of the limiting factors that we've seen in Washington is that, well, two things. One is that the material is high in potassium. It's the mineralogy of the rock is high in potassium. It's
yes,
but also a lot of the orchards come from either dairy farms, or they put a lot of manure which had high levels of potassium and also phosphorus. Actually, they correlate very well. High levels of potassium and high levels of phosphorus in the soil, but also some of them come from potato. So potato also is of high demand in potassium. So growers apply a lot of potassium. And because most of the soils are silt soil, that potassium have not moved away.
Stays there. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes, that's the important factor to consider.
Yeah, and I would love to show this in another time, but like you show, Terence show the levels of potassium in the soil for different orchards. We've done this also with a project that we have with Lee and Specialty Crop Program. This is the last year, and more than 60% of our orchard were excessive in potassium. And probably you will be very surprised, but we have sites that have above 700 parts per million of potassium in the soil.
Wow, that's 1,400 pounds of potassium per acre.
Exactly.
For the top 6 inches.
So
that's
Tim Smith calculated many years ago from WSU Extension that there's a 3,000-year supply of potassium in the typical Central Washington soil.
Yeah, we can sell a little bit of soil and share some potassium here, but also I think just going back to Bruce that says that in the high levels of potassium, and this is important for me to say because I think this integrated approach to understand what is your limiting factor, because I agree with Bruce, there are soils that are very high in potassium and the trees are weak and the trees are low in bitter pit. And that's mostly what I've seen here in Washington is because those soils are also very high in sodium. That comes also with the compost, but also the salinity levels and pH levels are very high in these soils. So your problem is maybe potassium levels are secondary and your biggest problem maybe is high salinity. And we've seen that in some orchards in the Marua area, which are sandy soils, but we still have a layer that impedes drainage. So the problem that you have there is a different problem. And the other way around too, we have soils that have very low levels of potassium and you have high levels of bitter pit, and probably your problem there might be nitrogen or water, excessive water or something. So,
or tree vigor.
Exactly.
Tree vigor is a biggie. On the topic of compost, we haven't done a really good job of keeping the information that a finished compost is under 0.75% in, and anything that's in the 2 to 3% range is basically manure, and it hasn't been turned or really well processed to be an organic material source compost. And so there's really an interesting spread. And going through my 1970s era soils class, where we talked about green manure crops and manure applications and all of that, it's pretty important to understand what you're applying. Now, the Research Commission did a trial with composted yard waste in a regulated deficit irrigation. Actually, it was a partial root zone irrigation trial with Horst Kaspari in Quincy. And we had some trees that looked really, really weak from the irrigation treatment, and Granstein put in some compost on the surface, and this was a buried drip trial. So there was actually no water going through the compost whatsoever. but those treated trees were so different in their leaf color, vigor, and all of that. It looked like they were fertilized and farmed completely separate. And it was just a 4-inch application of organic matter on top of the buried drip. And we did a series of leaf samples, and it was amazing to see what that layer of compost on top of the soil. It was 4 inches deep by 3 by 3 under each of the trees that were planted 14 by 6. So organic matter and water play such big roles that sometimes we get caught up in chasing the details and miss the big picture.
Yep. Thank you, Tom.
I think that some of our leaf nitrogens and Honeycrisp production are somewhere between 1.6 and 2%. So I think a number of our Honeycrisp growers are running a lower nitrogen level, and I think that 2% is a breaking point for annual cropping. That if we get too low, that we'll trigger some biennial bearing.
Absolutely, Tom. I just want to emphasize that even with the Gala, our trials show that when the leaf nitrogen level gets below 1.7, 1.6, the trees just don't form flowers. So with Honeycrisp, but I think the situation is even worse because it's prone to biennial bearing to begin with. So I think when you control leaf nitrogen level, you don't want to go to the extreme. That's very important. And also, when you bring the leaf nitrogen level to below, let's say 1.9%, the zonal chlorosis would show up earlier and more severe. So just keep that in mind.
Thanks everyone who stayed on with us this late this evening.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Bye.